Hello and welcome to this video on two new modules from Nekyia circuits, Ceremony and Sigil. One is a character-packed twin peak filter and the other a function generator. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Nekyia Circuits, and this video is part of my free patches series where we distill the demo down to just 3 examples, but then take some extra time to develop and explore those free patches. Here we have Ceremony and Sigil, and let's just get straight into the modules and their features. Sigil is a compact 4HP wide function generator. We have a trigger input, or selectable via a jumper on the back of the module, a slew input, and this can then either generate an envelope from the trigger or slew your signal with rise or attack controls, fall time or decay controls, and we have CV over that rise and fall time that adds to those knobs too. There's also a shape control that blends between exponential through linear to logarithmic curves, and there's a handy output level control that can take the output from plus 10 volts or through being inverted to minus 10 volts. There's also a button to toggle looping on and off, and that's CV controllable by this input too, turning this into an LFO or VCO, or you can use that alongside your triggers to add bursts and loops within an otherwise triggered stream of envelopes. Moving on to Ceremony, this is 10 HP and it's a twin peak filter resonator. It's a dual analog 18 dB slope filter inspired by Rob Hordike's twin peak design. And it has an interesting morphing state control at its core, which when this is all the way left is a low pass filter, where filter 2 is simply a modulator to modulate that low pass filter's frequency, or you can crossfade and smoothly morph across to this being a dual bandpass filter, still with the option to route some FM across from one side to the other. You have 2 inputs, 1 and 2, and those blend together with this crossfader here, and you also have a CV crossfade input. And that mixed crossfaded signal then hits both of these filters. You have a filter A frequency control and a filter B frequency control. They have individual CVA and CVB CV inputs for frequency, as well as attenuverters for both of those. And there's a both input that will add any signal that you input there to the frequency control of both filters at the same time. So as we mentioned with that low pass setup, in both modes here you have an FM mod, which is the audio output of filter B there, frequency modulating filter A. So either a low pass modulated by a band that we're not hearing, or the second band there modulating the frequency of the first. And you can modulate the depth of that modulation, modulated modulation, via the FM mod CV input. We have a Q control for our resonance, and voltage controlled resonance at the Q input. Both filters have their own feedback controls, which will route their outputs back into themselves. That adds a ton of character, either playing around with those or in tandem with that FM mod control as well. There's then a final VCA stage, and this is just normaled fully open, like a standard filter's output here. But when you patch in a voltage, that will take over controlling an output VCA, so you can shape your notes with envelopes or other signals, and your signal then appears at the final output. Ceremony just oozes character, and the video is going to focus on that mainly with rich expressive synth riffs where we modulate literally everything, some impressive morphing filter pings, where I think we modulate nearly everything or everything again, and then some massive twin peak resonator drones where we pretty much modulate everything again, and throughout we'll use Sigil for some interesting modulation alongside the filter. Enjoy the video, skip around the patches that are on screen and in the description, and there's an added Patreon extra exclusive video if that's of interest, link down below. But without further ado, let's dive in. As with any kind of filter demo, Let's take a listen to the filter first. I'll try and be quick, and anything significant I'm doing, I'll put a little overlay on screen. So this patch is just about modulating everything, and it just sounds so good. There's obviously loads of effects which I'll remove. Let me just play around for a moment. I'm really loving this patch. So here I've kind of cancelled everything out. The only thing we have is this blue trace envelope to the VCA. I've crossfaded across to my first input, which is just a simple saw wave from a cult here. And you can hear, even with the Q down, we've got that nice resonant character. There's a little bit of modulation of the decay time on cadence, the envelope from Nekyia there controlling the VCA. And if I crossfade across to input 2 here, that's a sub square wave, again from a cult. So the first thing I did was actually blend with this green trace and green cables slow envelope. That's coming through mutes, so I can just turn that on and off. You can see there at the peaks of the LFO, pushing to the saw and then coming down to that sub. And then with the modulation that's modulating the decay time for the VCA, I started playing around with modulating the Q here. So if I turn that on, let's turn up the Q a bit first, the resonance. With some fairly subtle but changes there in that resonance modulation. I then started to introduce FM from filter B. But the easiest way to hear that, if I actually just turn down filter A and we move across to 2 band passes here, here's filter B. And I have a different envelope rhythm here. Again, it's a decay envelope from cadence. So you can hear that band. Now going back across to the low pass where we don't hear filter B and it's just going to be a modulator. As I bring up the FM mod, you can hear that pew, pew. Filter B is modulating the frequency of A now, but as I'm modulating with this envelope, you can hear the effects of modulating it come through the modulation to the other side. And I was playing with when that happened with another LFO here. It's another triangle from Obsidian. It's an LED cable so you can visualize it. I then added a copy of my Volt Proctive signal to both filters. This will move both filter frequencies. You can hear those higher notes are just opening up a bit brighter now. Without it, we're at a static filter level other than that FM modulation. But with the base frequency of both filters now is following my pitch signal. And then finally on the yellow trace here and yellow cables, this is Sigil, the functional generator, with modulated decay times, creating a dynamic, interesting envelope that I'm going to use for the frequency of A, the main frequency there of that low pass filter. That's again in mutes, so muting it. And then just for some added weight and a good fun time, let's add some feedback. Such a good sound. We can also feedback around B, why not? Now if you'd like a zoomed out full patch breakdown, I'll do that exclusively for Patreon supporters on patreon.com/DivKid. There's also a couple of other patch techniques I'll pull out for future videos from this patch too. But for now, let's get into that second patch with Ceremony and Sigil. So here we're looking at some interesting morphing filter pings. And having the dual filters for like a twin peak ping, like two tones to that pinged filter, having the VCA to play with the level of those pings, the ability on board to FM one filter from the other, we can add feedback even, to really change that character, and options to modulate one or both frequencies, crossfade between different input triggers. A really interesting patch going on. So we're in at the dual bandpass mode here. We've morphed across from low pass, and with the crossfade on input 1, I have one rhythm, a trigger, striking that audio input, and there's our filter ping. Now on the other input, if I crossfade across to input 2, I have a different rhythm. And because that's a blend, it's a crossfade, it's not a switch between input 1 and 2, we can have a really interesting behaviour where we're mainly on one input, but we let a lower level kind of ping trigger into that filter. So you can hear there already we have this kind of like dual dynamic filter ping where this one is our main rhythm, input 1, and this one, input 2, is going to be a lower level kind of background ping, if you like. Now we have the two filters, so it can create interesting points, tunings between those two frequencies. I've had FM on there, let's turn that off. Going to a low pass. That's a single filter being pinged. Pinged. then going to 2 band passes. It's really easy to dial in some nice behaviour. I'm playing around with Q, which when you're pinging a filter that's nearly oscillating, giving us that note, your resonance or Q acts almost like a decay. So if I bring in this green trace, green cables, everything's up in mute just to make it easy so I'm not unpatching. Have some modulation of Q. Pushing up into more resonance, creating an interesting pattern, more dynamic than just static filter pings. And with that background, already kind of 2-layer dynamic ping happening at the input stage. We can then add, say, a little bit of FM. Where filter B modulates the frequency of A. And I have this sequence, the blue trace, coming in to modulate that amount. So with that just up a tiny bit, I'll unmute that modulation. It's quite an interesting effect modulating the depth of FM modulation there. And then on these red cables, I have a third sequence here that I can route to CVA or B or both. I'm not patched into both, but I have the same signal coming out of 2 channels here. If I just modulate frequency B, I'm starting to build up these interesting kind of little robotic riffs coming out of going to CVA there, or both. And I can play around muting and unmuting where that goes as the patch plays. And then finally, changing the level overall, I have my signal plugged in here so that overrides the offset on that VCA. If I turn down the offset in wand here and turn up the effect of this envelope coming from Sigil, I'm striking this once at the start of every bar. We can make that, say, just a decay envelope. That's the overall output of everything, because it's that final VCA across the output. We could strike that multiple times from my sequencer. And start to cut into that kind of stream of filter pings before it. Without it, and just offsetting that VCA open. That's our pattern. And then with the envelope, it's another way to inject rhythm and life into the sound. I'm going to stick with just a rising envelope. Just playing around with tuning here. Could add some feedback. Adding in some effects. There's great kind of alien robotic filter ping hooks. Almost sounds like a whole modular synth patch within one there, with the feedback, the FM, the dual filters, the extra VCA over the shape and final level of those notes and sounds. Little hi-hat in the background. And a kick. Perfect, creating these kind of little techno gestures. So for this last example, I wanted to use all that character that Ceremony offers to create some really interesting sounds on top of a cleaner digital oscillator that's doing some interesting morphing wavetable sounds. And then to use its twin peak, twin bandpass filter to create lots of movement and development in the sound, just with lots of slow, mainly free moving modulation. And then Sigil here, I wanted to explore modulating its rise time and its fall time, turning on and off the looping, and creating an interesting shifting pattern that's both triggered regularly from a sequencer, but then modulating randomly, and again just creating lots of movement. I'm playing a keyboard off screen, so if you hear a pitch change like this, that's me just playing the keyboard without octave controlling plats. There's a ton of reverb, I'll remove it, strip back the patch, and we'll build it back up again. So here's the dry output of Ceremony. I've gone across morphing, crossfading back across to that single low pass mode, and there's no influence from the second filter, so it's as clean as we're going to get. My first output here is the main output from plats. I've got LFOs moving through a wavetable, some obsidian and another external triangle just slowly morphing through those wavetable tones. Now, as plats has two outputs, I'm using the second output as the second input. So if I crossfade across to that one, you can hear this noise. There's a more kind of fizzy, noisy character, and I'll blend to and from those two inputs. It almost feels like just crossfading in a noise source. That's purely the difference between those two plats outputs there. And that was the first thing I started modulating. Using this modulation here, green tracing cables that I'll turn on to crossfade between those inputs. And that's the max output there on those two obsidian LFOs. It's a logic max function between those two triangles. So moving between those inputs, the next thing that I added was going across to that twin peak bandpass mode. So we have one band and another, setting them roughly the same in the middle, and then using the same oscillator, just a standard analog oscillator as an LFO, the sine wave to modulate the cutoff on one side, and the triangle wave, it's the same frequency, just a triangle instead of a sine, to modulate the other side. So CVA and CVB here. But I've attenuated them in opposing ways, so as the sine ramps up the frequency of A, the triangle ramps down the frequency of B. So you kind of have these overlapping, windowing bandpass frequencies here. And then in the both input we have Sigil here, which is being triggered by a gate sequence from my sequencer. But on every trigger that triggers the envelope there, I'm actually creating a random voltage and randomly modulating rise and fall times, and then also using some probability to create a random trigger off of that main gate sequence and trigger the toggling on and off. I have some offset to the frequencies here and some attenuation. So in this module here, there's a wider depth or bigger depth of modulation from Sigil here. And as the function won't re-trigger when it's rising, if the random modulation of rise time is too long, we'll just get this really long constant rise that interrupts that flow like this. And then when it goes back into its falling stage, it will re-trigger again. Adding some FM of A's frequency from B, and modulating that amount of FM modulation with a square wave from this obsidian LFO, and a bit of feedback for good measure. Let's really lean into that character on Ceremony there. Some different notes. Really great character over those wavetables. And I'll just back off the amount of modulation to both frequencies there from Sigil. bit of offset to bring that frequency up. And then drench the whole thing in more reverb than you could probably get away with realistically. Is there such a thing as too much reverb? I don't know, but if there is, this is probably too much. Good fun though. So morphing, slowly developing droning tones from plats there, crossfading between two different sounds from plats, pausing modulation of these two band frequencies, complex modulated modulation of all the frequencies, and then leaning into onboard FM and feedback. Just some really lovely twin peak filter drones. If you've got this far in the video, drop a Sigil sync down in the comments. Check out the modules, check out some other Nekyia Circuits modules with a video linked below. Head to patreon.com/DivKid for that extra exclusive video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!